Hello and welcome to the FNAF Book Club, where we look into any and all FNAF literature. My name is Cthulhu's, and tonight I'll be your host. We are going to be looking into the books in the FNAF series in depth, but I thought before we begin, I'd like to discuss some things that will come up throughout this video series. Basically, this video is a good way for me to cover the tools I'll use as I go about reading and considering these works. That way, they're all roughly outlined in one place that I can refer back to, or refer other people back to, as I go along. Readings. The first of these topics is the different readings someone can make of a text. This is one of the fundamental aspects of literary assessment. For the sake of example, imagine a fantasy novel about an underwater society where mermaids are in charge. One person might discuss this novel in the context of feminism and what the structure in the mermaid society the protagonist lives in means when compared to our world. Someone else might make a reading of the text that's completely dependent on talking about what they think this novel means, as linked to the author and their life history. Someone else might just look at it literally, talking about the novel isolated from the world, the author, and everything else. All of these examples are different readings of our fictional text. None of them are more correct than the others, all of them bring valid thoughts to the table. Modes of reading fall in and out of fashion over the years, but it can help if you're assessing a piece of media to look into other readings you could do. It can open up new avenues of thought you might not have even considered. For the purposes of this series, I'll be doing a reading of the Frights, Tales and novels which pays close attention to Scott as an author, and every other piece of media that falls within the Five Nights at Freddy's series. I'll be rejecting the concept more or less that any one person can have an objective experience of the world. Embracing everyone's experience is both subject to their own assumptions, biases, culture and framework of thought, while also valid for what they are. I give my readings of the text as food for thought, not as anything concrete, as I believe the concept of a factual opinion is a contradiction in itself. Parallels. Train tracks are the best example I can think of parallel lines. Two lines going the same direction but which never touch. It's the same with literary parallels. When I personally talk about parallels, I typically mean events, characters, or locations with shared similarities with one another. These things are never the same, but I think the shared traits are often intentional and point us in the direction of hints or even the general shape of events elsewhere. FNAF is a unique series where the main line of game events is full of mysterious gaps and unknowns. I think the novels give us the shape of events in some places without solidly answering our questions. An example of this, without using concrete book quotes, would be if we had a game that was missing the murder weapon, only to have a series of stories where various characters followed rough story beats of the game, but where characters consistently used a chainsaw as a murder weapon over and over. In this instance, I would infer there was a strong possibility, though never certainty, that the murder weapon in the game was a chainsaw. We see parallels in all sorts of places: names, locations, actions, personalities, and traits. Part of the real joy of the stories to me is to find parallels and links between the two different medias. It's my favourite thing to do and something I find very fun. If someone pointing out the similarities between two disparate things is upsetting for you, then my videos probably won't be the place for you. Allegory, parables, and analogy. Literature uses various techniques to make comment on the larger world through the framework of a story. We see some of these present to varying degrees within the FNAF novels and short stories, and you might hear me refer to these now and then as we go along. Allegory is a very old technique where a character, place, or event can become symbolic of something else. Originally this was very direct, with characters literally named Terror representing the concept of terror, but over the course of human history this gained nuance. The Bible as an early text is full of allegory. A common example would be the story of the prodigal son, where a selfish son returns home to his wealthy father and is embraced fully. This story was meant to illustrate to early people the forgiving nature of the biblical God by personifying God as the father and the people as the son. Allegory can be applied to works the author did not intend to be allegorical, and the value of this can be debated. Scott is absolutely familiar with the concept of allegory, as anyone from a religious background almost certainly is. He literally made an entire animated movie and game on his own based on the Pilgrim's Progress, one of the most well-known examples of allegorical literature in modern times. The story of the prodigal son is not only an allegory, but it is what we call a parable. Parables are a means of instructing a lesson or principle via the vehicle of a story. It often serves to make abstract thoughts more relatable. An example of a parable would be a story of a goat trained to nod its head when asked if it had understood a book. This is not only a story about a goat, but was used to illustrate the concept of a person who agrees to something they do not understand. Parables often have an element of moral instruction, and though not everywhere in the FNAF books, it is worth establishing what this term entails. Finally in this section, I'd like to discuss the concept of analogy. This concept is tied to the idea of parallels. It's how we transfer meaning from one subject to another. In literature, we use it to compare similarities or parallels between two unrelated things. Metaphors and similes place two objects side by side clearly within the text. A good example of a simile is life is like a mountain. Metaphors take a little bit more of a step back and let the reader consider what it means. This would be something like, life is a mountain. An analogy is a larger comparison with a broader point to make. The example in this case might be, life is like a mountain. It's a torturously hard climb, but when you get to the top, the view is worth it all. There's more detail in this analogy, though you might notice it still contains the simile. You can use smaller similes and metaphors within the larger scope of an analogy to make a point linking concepts. This is something we see constantly within the FNAF series, as you might expect, and something I also enjoy unpicking. Themes. Themes are another very old concept for humans. An example of themes might be good, evil, love, revenge, coming of age. These are the kind of terms you might offer when asked, well, what was this story about? Themes themselves are an underlying meaning explored within a work. It can be impressed on us through use of any part of the work. Characters, conversations, narrative, anything can contain parts of a theme. People have always wrestled with grand themes, and literature provides an excellent tool with which to do so. Themes are very important to this series, and I'll be discussing my own thoughts on what themes are important as we go along. Once again, my thoughts are not absolute, and it's perfectly valid to disagree. One work can have many themes. As an example, I might say that the storyline of FNAF is themed around revenge, that of the children against their murderer. However, it might also be a story about families, about parental relationships, about life and death. Themes are a springboard we can use to discuss the larger thoughts underpinning what we enjoy. Expect to hear a good bit about them. The canon. Now this is a term that gets thrown around in the FNAF fandom until it loses all meaning. There are two main meanings of this word. One is the entire body of work by a respective author. Scott's canon of work in this case would be everything he's created, from games to novels and everything in between. The other definition of a canon is much looser. This is the works in any field that are generally agreed to be good, important, or worthy of study. You can see why this might be a problem. Mobs of unassociated people very rarely agree on what's worthy. This has been a problem within literature for centuries. The accepted canon of English language literature was curated by a very, very small group of men and overseen by the religious leaders of the time. Would this really represent a true sample of what was worthy? Because of the absolute unreliability of a canon maintained and curated by a bunch of random people of random ages within a fandom who can't agree on anything, I'm opting when I discuss canon to simply mean legitimately tied to Scott's works, all of them, and any of them. I might talk about different canon EUs. In this case, I'm referring to the fact there are discussions about the timeline, events, and continuities of the different parts of the franchise, all running parallel to one another. These are known as alternate universes. Basically, there might be a story about William Afton doing murders in a book, but it doesn't line up with any of the other established murders. At that point, we give it its own universe where these events unfolded differently. People are always keen to fold universes into one another and answer questions that way, but I'm far more reticent to do so. Smooshing every AU we have together at this point only creates more confusion. So you'll find me considering alternate universes fairly frequently as we go along. Other people might disagree with some that I choose to keep separate, and as always, that's fine. Just to complicate things, Scott frequently has crossover nods between separate continuities and games within his works, such as characters from the Chipper and Sons games appearing in the Freddy in Space 2 Troll game, or Coffee from A Desolate Hope appearing in Help Wanted. But this is all the more reason for us to consider the entire body of work valid in our understanding. We never know where it will come into play. Therefore, I consider every work, everything that Scott has created, both valid and worthy of investigation, even the outliers that many in the fandom may consider worthless. Thinking about you, colouring books. In my search, no stone is unturned. Conclusion. Anyway, if you're still listening, I'd like to thank you for sticking with me this far. I felt like it was important to roughly outline some of these terms that I will use, rather than do it every single time I use them. I'm flawed, my opinions are flawed, and I will gladly change my thoughts whenever I'm presented with new compelling evidence. I adjust as my understanding does. Things I state today might not be how I feel tomorrow. But I do have a very good time doing this stuff and reading these books, and I hope you'll have a fun time coming along with me for the ride. There are many works to cover by so many authors, but I'm excited. And here's to the next video.